I remember that evening like it was yesterday. The setting sun spilled orange hues through the blinds, casting long shadows across the living room where I sat. My mind a swirl of disbelief and anger. It was just another ordinary day until my phone buzzed with a message from Dave, an old buddy from college. "Hey man, saw something odd, thought you should know," the message read. I called him immediately, my heart pounding in my chest. "Jake, I saw Lizzie at the cafe downtown." Dave's voice was hesitant. "She was with some guy, looked cozy, didn't seem like a work thing." My world stopped. Lizzie, my wife, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, in a cafe with another man? It couldn't be true. I confronted her that night. She walked in, her hair slightly disheveled, a flush to her cheeks. She was beautiful as always, but something in her eyes flickered when she saw the look on my face. "Lizzie, are you seeing someone else?" My voice was steady, but inside I was crumbling. There was a pause, a moment suspended in time, where I hoped it was all a misunderstanding. But then she said it, her voice cold and detached. "Yes, I am. It's my boss, Mark. And I won't stop." I couldn't believe it. The woman I loved, the one I shared my dreams in bed with, was telling me she was having an affair. And she wasn't sorry. There was no apology, no tears, just a blunt confession. "What about us, Lizzie? What about our marriage?" I was grasping at straws, trying to find some sliver of the woman I married in her eyes. "Our marriage? Jake, I need more. I need excitement, passion. You just don't get it." That night I left. I packed a bag with shaking hands, my mind a blur of memories and broken dreams. Walking out of our shared home, I felt a mix of freedom and guilt. Freedom from a lie I had been living, and guilt for not seeing it sooner. The street was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps that cast long shadows on the pavement. I walked without direction, my steps echoing in the quiet night. I had loved her with all my heart, but in that moment I realized love wasn't always enough. As I wandered through the streets, my mind replayed our years together. The laughter, the fights, the quiet moments, and the loud ones. All of it felt like a distant dream, shattered by the harsh reality of her betrayal. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing for certain: there was no going back. The life I knew, the life I loved, was over. And in its place was a gaping hole, filled with questions, doubts, and the overwhelming pain of betrayal. That night marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. A chapter where I was alone, thrust into an unfamiliar world without the person I thought would be by my side forever. But sometimes you need to lose everything to find out who you really are. And this was my beginning. The day Lizzie moved out, the house felt strangely empty, like someone had sucked the air out of it. I watched from the window as she loaded her things into her car, her movements swift and determined. There wasn't any of the hesitation you might expect from someone leaving their life behind. It was as if she was eager to start anew without me. I wasn't surprised when I heard about her job promotion a few weeks later. Mark, her boss, and now the reason for our broken marriage, had always favored her. I could imagine them in the office, her laughing at his jokes, him gazing at her with that look men have when they're more than just interested. Stung, but not in the way it used to. It was more of a dull, constant ache, a reminder of what was lost. With the new job came a new Lizzie. She traded her modest sedan for a sleek sports car, one that roared down the street as she drove away from what used to be our home. Her clothes became more expensive, her nights out more frequent. Through the grapevine of mutual friends, I heard about her parties, her trips to exotic places, her name on VIP lists at clubs. It was a lifestyle she had always craved but never had with me. But as her life became more lavish, her circle of friends started shrinking. Our old friends, the ones we used to have game nights with, slowly distanced themselves. I'd see them occasionally, and the look in their eyes was a mix of pity and discomfort. They didn't know how to talk about Lizzie, or maybe they didn't want to. She had become a taboo topic, a ghost haunting our conversations. The news of her engagement to Mark came as a rumor at first. I was grabbing a coffee when I overheard someone at the next table. "Did you hear about Lizzie and her boss? Engaged already, can you believe it?" The words hit me like a punch in the gut. Engaged. The word echoed in my mind as I walked back home, the coffee forgotten and growing cold in my hand. I wasn't sure how to feel. Part of me wanted to scream, to shout at the injustice of it all. Another part of me, a quieter, more resigned part, was just tired. Tired of the drama, the pain, the constant reminders of a life that was no longer mine. That night I sat in my living room, the silence enveloping me. The walls were lined with pictures of happier times, mocking me with memories of a past that felt like a different life. I realized then that it wasn't just Lizzie who had moved out. It was the laughter, the love, the warmth. All of it gone, leaving behind nothing but empty spaces. As I looked around, I knew that this was just the beginning. The beginning of a new chapter. One where I had to learn who I was without Lizzie. It was a daunting thought, but in that vast echoing silence, I found a glimmer of something like hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could find myself again in the ruins of what we had. Maybe in the end that was what I needed all along. After Lizzie left, the months blurred into a mosaic of routine and solitude. Life without her was a quiet hum, uneventful and monotonous. But her life, as I heard through hushed conversations and second-hand stories, was anything but. She dove into wedding planning with a fervor that surprised even those who knew her well. Lizzie had always loved the finer things, and her wedding was shaping up to be a spectacle. I heard about the lavish venue, the designer dress, the guest list that read like a who's who of the city's elite. It seemed like she was living in a dream, a fairy tale spun from silk and diamonds. But fairy tales don't always have happy endings. As the wedding drew closer, whispers reached my ears about the friends she was losing. The same friends who had shared our dinner table, laughed at our jokes, were now turning their backs on her. They couldn't reconcile the Lizzie they knew with the woman who had betrayed her husband and flaunted her affair. In their place, a new crowd gathered around her. People drawn to the glitz and glamour, to the allure of scandal. I saw pictures of her online, always smiling, always surrounded by these new friends. But her eyes, once bright with genuine joy, now held a glint of something else. Desperation, maybe, or loneliness. Meanwhile, I was rebuilding my life in a way I never expected. I started focusing more on my hobbies, got back in touch with old friends, even began dating again. It wasn't easy, moving on from the wreckage of a failed marriage, but I was finding moments of happiness in the unlikeliest of places. When Lizzie heard about my new life, I wondered how she felt. Did she regret her decisions? Did she envy the simple, honest happiness I was finding? I heard from a mutual acquaintance that she'd asked about me. Her voice tinged with something that sounded like regret. Then came her wedding day. A day that should have been perfect. But it wasn't. The disaster struck out of nowhere, like a storm on a clear day. The lavish venue she had booked went bankrupt just days before the wedding. The news spread like wildfire. A juicy piece of gossip for those who thrived on schadenfreude. The wedding was hastily moved to a lesser venue, one that lacked the opulence Lizzie had so desired. Guests murmured, the glamour of the event tarnished by the last-minute change. I heard about it from a friend, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of something. Not happiness certainly, but not sadness either. It was a complex mix of emotions, a reminder of the life we once dreamed of together, now just a faded echo. That day, as Lizzie walked down the aisle in a less grandiose setting, with fewer friends and a crowd of strangers, I found myself at a small cafe, the sun warm on my face, a faint smile on my lips. Life had taken us on divergent paths, paths that once intertwined but were now worlds apart. In that moment, sipping my coffee and watching the world go by, I realized something important. Happiness isn't found in the grand gestures or the lavish parties. It's in the small, quiet moments, the ones that pass unnoticed if you're not careful. And as Lizzie said her vows in a setting far removed from her dreams, I hoped she would find that happiness too, in her own way, on her own path. Months had passed since Lizzie's wedding. The glitz and glamour of the big day had faded, replaced by the reality of a marriage built on shaky ground. I heard bits and pieces about her life with Mark through mutual friends, and none of it sounded like the happy ending she had envisioned. Their troubles began early, the honeymoon phase barely lasting. Mark, who had once showered her with affection and gifts, had become distant and preoccupied. Lizzie, accustomed to being the center of attention, struggled with the sudden change. She'd call me sometimes, under the guise of discussing some leftover joint financial matter, but her voice often betrayed her loneliness and frustration. Then came the financial troubles. Their lavish lifestyle, funded by two incomes that seemed limitless, hit a snag. I heard that Mark's business was in trouble, and the luxurious trips, the fancy dinners, and the high-end shopping sprees became a source of contention. Lizzie, who had never been good with money, found herself in a web of credit card debts and unpaid bills. The strain on their marriage was palpable, even from a distance. Then whispers of infidelity began to surface. Lizzie had always been possessive, and now, insecure in her tumultuous marriage, she grew paranoid. She suspected Mark of having an affair. Her trust eroded by the foundation of their own relationship and affair. One evening they had a heated argument at a restaurant, a place I used to go to with Lizzie. It was a high-end exclusive place, the kind where everyone knew everyone. Word got around quickly. She accused him of seeing someone else, her voice rising with every word, drawing the attention of the entire restaurant. Mark, calm and collected, denied everything, but the damage was done. The scene ended with Lizzie storming out, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. That public spectacle was the talk of the town for days. Friends who were there told me how embarrassed she looked, how people whispered and pointed. Lizzie, who had always cared so much about appearances, had her private life exposed for all to see. After that incident, her calls to me stopped. I could only imagine the turmoil she was going through. A part of me felt sorry for her. Despite everything, I remembered the good times we had shared, the dreams we had built together. But another part of me knew this was the inevitable outcome of the choices she had made. Sitting in my quiet living room, far removed from the chaos of Lizzie's world, I reflected on how our lives had diverged. We had started on the same path, but somewhere along the way we had taken different turns. Her path had led her to a world of glitz but little substance, a house of cards waiting to collapse. Mine had been quieter, less dramatic, but in many ways more fulfilling. Life, I realized, is about choices. The choices we make define us, shape our paths, and determine our happiness. And sometimes the pursuit of something more, something better, leads us away from what truly matters. I hoped, for Lizzie's sake, that she would find her way back to what was real and meaningful, but I knew that was a journey she would have to make on her own. It's strange how life can turn on a dime. One minute you're up, the next you're spiraling down so fast it makes your head spin. That's what happened to Lizzie, my ex, the woman I once thought I'd spend my life with. The beginning of her downfall started with an old flame. I heard from mutual friends once who still talked to me anyway that her first love, a guy from her college days, had reappeared. They started meeting in secret, rekindling what they had lost years ago. Lizzie, already struggling in her marriage, seemed to be searching for something. A piece of her past, maybe, or an escape from her present. But secrets have a way of coming out. Mark, her husband, caught them. I don't know the details, but I can imagine the scene, the shock, the anger, the sense of betrayal. It wasn't long after that he filed for divorce. The irony wasn't lost on me. Their marriage had begun with an affair, and now was ending because of another. Their divorce turned messy real quick. There was a bitter dispute over assets. The house, the cars, the savings, everything was up for grabs. Lizzie, who had once lived for luxury, found herself fighting to keep a semblance of the lifestyle she was accustomed to. Around the same time, she lost her job. The scandal of her affair and the divorce had reached her workplace. In a world where reputation is everything, hers was tarnished beyond repair. She tried to put on a brave face, but I knew she was struggling. The high-flying executive, once the talk of the town for her success, was now the subject of pitying glances and gossip. Then came the isolation. The friends who had flocked to her side during her days of glamour started to drift away. In their place was a gaping void of loneliness. The reality hit her hard. When you're up, everyone wants to be your friend. But when you're down, that's when you see who's real and who's not. Desperate to maintain her lifestyle, Lizzie resorted to questionable means. I heard rumors, nothing concrete, but whispers of dodgy deals, of debts to the wrong kind of people. She was spiraling, grasping at straws to hold onto a life that was slipping away. Legal troubles soon followed. Something about fraud, again, I didn't know the details, but it was serious. The law caught up with her, and her once bright future seemed dimmer than ever. The final blow was the public exposure of her scandal. It was all over the news, social media, everywhere. The details of her affairs, her divorce, her legal troubles, all laid bare for the world to see. Lizzie, who had once thrived in the spotlight, was now its victim. Sitting in my quiet living room, a world away from the chaos of her life, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. Lizzie and I had shared something real once before it all went wrong. But choices have consequences, and hers had caught up with her in the most devastating way. Her story, once a tale of success and glamour, had turned into a cautionary tale of loss and despair. And as the sun set, casting long shadows across my floor, I realized that life is a series of choices, and each one leads us down a path. Some paths lead to happiness, others to ruin. Lizzie's path had led her to a place of isolation and regret, a far cry from the bright future she once seemed destined for. I watched from a distance, a bystander to the drama that unfolded. Her court battle was the beginning of the end. Charged with fraud, she stood before a judge, her face a mask of fear and defiance. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Every eye was on her as the prosecutor laid out the case, painting a picture of deceit and desperation. The verdict was a blow that echoed through her life. Guilty. The word hung in the air, heavy with consequence. In the aftermath, her assets were seized. The luxury car, the designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, all taken as part of the legal proceedings. It was a swift, brutal stripping away of the life she had built. Public opinion, once her ally, now turned against her. The same people who had celebrated her success now reveled in her downfall. She became a social pariah, her name synonymous with scandal. The whispers and stares followed her everywhere, a constant reminder of how far she had fallen. In her desperation, Lizzie tried to claw back some semblance of her former life. She attempted to mingle in social circles, but the doors that once opened so easily for her were now firmly shut. Her attempts were met with cold shoulders and turned backs. The world she once ruled had cast her out. Amidst the chaos, a new love interest entered her life, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. He was different from the others, or so she thought. He seemed to understand her, to accept her despite her tarnished reputation. But it was not to be. In a cruel twist of fate, he too betrayed her, leaving her more alone than ever. That was when she hit rock bottom. The realization of how far she had fallen was a painful awakening. The woman who once had everything now had nothing. Her home, once a symbol of her success, was lost to financial ruin. Evicted, she found herself with nowhere to go. Her belongings stuffed into boxes, a stark contrast to the life she once led. Even her family, who had stood by her through thick and thin, reached their breaking point. The strain of her legal troubles, the scandal, the public disgrace, it was too much. They distanced themselves, unable to bear the weight of her choices. And then came the health crisis, a scare that landed her in the hospital, alone and vulnerable. It was a stark reminder of her mortality, of the fragile thread that life hangs on. Sitting in my quiet house, the news of Lizzie's latest misfortune reached me. It was hard to reconcile the image of the vibrant, ambitious woman I had married with the broken figure she had become. I felt a pang of sadness, a remnant of the love we once shared. But it was tempered by the knowledge that her downfall was the result of her own choices, a path she had chosen to walk. Her story, once a tale of triumph, was now a cautionary tale of loss and regret. A reminder that the choices we make have consequences, that the pursuit of wealth and status can lead to ruin. In the end, Lizzie's fall from grace was a journey she walked alone. A journey that took her from the heights of success to the depths of despair. But the world wasn't done dealing her blows. The associates she had teamed up with, those she thought were her allies in this new venture, turned on her. They took her money, her ideas, and left her with nothing but broken promises. It was a betrayal that cut deep, leaving her more isolated than ever. In her desperation, she reached out to me. I got an email one day, her words a mix of apology, regret, and a plea for help. But for me it was too little, too late. The wounds of our past were still raw, the betrayal still fresh. I couldn't find it in me to offer her the support she sought. My response was brief, indifferent. A clear message that I had moved on. That was when she had her moment of clarity. It came to her, as these things often do, in the quiet of the night. She realized the extent of her wrongdoings, the pain she had caused, the bridges she had burned. But as is often the case, her realization came too late. Despite her newfound understanding, her situation continued to worsen. Debts piled up, her health deteriorated, and the few friends she had left drifted away. She was a ship adrift in a storm, battered by the waves of her own making. Then came the final blow, the legal verdict. The court found her guilty in a case related to her business dealings. It was the nail in the coffin of her attempts at redemption. The sentence was harsh, a reflection of the gravity of her crimes. It was a verdict that sealed her fate. Support, both moral and material, was minimal. The few who had once been close to her now kept their distance, unwilling or unable to be associated with her downfall. It was a lonely time for her, one where she had to face the consequences of her actions alone. The final loss came in the form of her beloved dog, a loyal companion that had been with her through thick and thin. The dog, sick and unable to be cared for by Lizzie in her current state, had to be given up. It was a heart-wrenching decision, one that left her feeling utterly bereft. In the end, Lizzie found herself alone and forgotten. The once successful, vibrant woman had become a shadow of her former self, isolated from the society that once adored her. Friends, family, colleagues all had turned their backs, leaving her to face her bleak future alone. Her story, once a tale of aspiration and achievement, ended in uncertainty. A future that once seemed so bright was now clouded with despair. Lizzie, who had once had it all, was left with nothing but her regrets and the haunting question of what might have been if only she had made different choices.